What's the best way to tackle knife crime? Why are some medicines in short supply? And who should be top of the list for social housing? This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio, Conservative MP Kieran Mullen, Labour's leader in the House of Lords, Angela Smith, Parth Patel from the centre-left think tank the IPPR and editor-in-chief of the website Unheard, Freddie Sayers. Today, the government promises a new crackdown on knife crime.
Carrying knives on the street is extremely serious, it's extremely dangerous. It's dangerous not just for other people, it's dangerous for the person carrying the knife.
Knife crime has gone up by a further 5% this year, 77% increase since 2015. This is an epidemic, we need action.
Police are told to make more use of stop and search powers, but is that the answer?
It is almost like just putting a plaster over a major wound, you know. And also, you have to understand, stop and search sometimes antagonises communities.
Also today, why are some medicines in short supply? We'll hear from one woman who's having to ration her medication. And does our guest hold the fate of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda bill in her hands?
Will the opposition in the appointed House of Lords try and frustrate the will of the people as expressed by the elected House, or will they get on board and do the right thing?
Let's start with one of the stories you heard in the headlines. This is The Guardian reporting Tory social housing plan aims to prioritise British homes for British workers. It's a report that Downing Street wants to give UK families higher priority for social housing. Kieran, UK families already have priority for social housing. So what's the problem that the government is trying to solve?
Well, I think this is just speculation at this stage. I don't think Downing Street's confirmed that there is any hard and fast policy in development.
They're saying it's a consultation on this.
Well, as I said, I don't think they've actually confirmed there's any new policy necessarily. I think it's true to say that in different parts of the country there is a lot of variation that you see in terms of the occupation of social housing. It depends how local councils tend to implement it. If there are parts of the country where we think it isn't working fairly, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that actually people who've spent a long time in a country contributing to its welfare state in one way or another get some extra help. I don't have a problem with that in principle, but you'd have to see how it works in practice.
But the rules at the moment are that, I mean, 90%, these are government figures, 90% of new social housing lets go to UK nationals.
Yeah. As I said, it's a variation across the country. So there might be a positive national figure, but you do see in different parts of the country, London in particular, the figures aren't the same as you're talking about on a national level. And so I think it's not wrong to say, let's look at how it's working at a local level. Can we do something to tweak that? And I don't have anything against the principle, which is that if you're part of a welfare state over a long period of time, you're paying into it over a long period of time, that you should get some recognition for that.
Right, there is some variation in the figures. Kieran is right, and we can come on to an example in just a moment. But broadly speaking, what's your reaction to the consultation? It isn't policy, but a consultation.
Well, it's the quickest backtrack I've ever heard, actually. But
well, I'm not the government, so I'm not backtracking policy.
Yeah,
it's just
but it wasn't in development. It's consultation. We thought we were going to see something like this in the King's speech. In fact, it turned out to be pretty inadequate proposals on leasehold reform for some people. Already, if we take into account issues like if you live locally, if you've got family locally, if you're working, it's taken into account. And the only people that can have social housing are people who are UK citizens and people who have a right to be here. So the problem the government needs to solve isn't who gets social housing, but how much social housing there is and how much building and lack of building there has been. That's why I think the Labour Party, to be honest, one of these issues that keeps, I think, a lot of politicians who care about this up at night. But we're pledging that 1.5 new homes should be built in that first term of a Labour government.
But that would be over 5 years. I mean, what would you do if a Labour government wins later on the year? What would you do?
You start building homes is clearly the thing to do, and you have to start that. But also, if the government really wants to have British people having their own home, why are we seeing? We can walk out of this door now and see it. Huge blocks going up, being bought up, flats being bought up by overseas investors and keeping them empty or renting them out to local people, exorbitant rents and prices going up. The real problem is the stock of housing stock, and in 14 years the government really hasn't done anything to address that. So that's why I think we see policies like this that they think might attract some people, but it's conning people they can solve the problem.
It's all very well to say that, but when you were last in, we built more social housing and more council housing than when you were last in power. So Labour can say these things, but their track record isn't as good as ours.
I think our track record's pretty cool.
Let me just come back to the question. I mean, should people, British-born or foreign nationals who've lived here for years and had their families here and their kids are born here, get priority over, broadly speaking, migrants or asylum seekers?
Right, look, it's worth saying that this is not policy yet. This is a consultation.
No, but I'm saying as an idea.
But even then, that this is a consultation is, to be honest, a pretty pathetic use of government time, right? Because not only does this policy misunderstand the basic causes of the crisis in social housing, which was there's a complete collapse in the new housing supply, but it also misunderstands who can access housing in this country, right? Already you have to be a UK citizen or someone with settled status to have access to social housing. So if being a UK citizen or having settled status is not the same as being British, what on earth does it mean to be British in this context?
I think we get the kind of morality of this upside down slightly. Already I heard in what Angela was saying, this idea that British homes for British people sounds sort of jingoistic. Is it a bit racist?
I didn't say that at all.
But there's the sense that it's a tactical thing to appeal to the right of the party, or maybe they're worried about Nigel Farage or whatever.
They haven't identified the problem.
Let me just say,
hasn't been
I think to most people,
properly.
they would question the morality of inviting so many people in when there are so few houses. The number of new social houses built was under 10,000 in the last year on record, and famously we now have nearly 750,000 new arrivals. That doesn't seem like a moral thing to do if we don't have the houses for them.
But those new arrivals won't be accessing social housing. We're talking about two different things here. We've heard, and I said as well, the people who access social housing are UK citizens and people who have given the right by the government to stay here. Those are two different things. Other people who haven't got the right to stay here aren't accessing social housing. So the problem becomes they're not building enough social housing.
If you've got to have a queue and you have an under-resourced, and whatever it is, it seems fair that the people who've been waiting longest should be at the front of the queue. That's a kind of very British principle of fairness. That's why you take
into account how long someone's lived in the area. Are there family connections in the area?
So there are local variations.
But
there are local variations, aren't there? Because councils and local authorities must have the right to make a decision on need. Does that lead to a perception that some people are jumping the queue?
Well, I think the point about local variation is actually slightly misunderstood, because the councils where a greater proportion of social housing are going to people born outside the UK are councils where the majority of the population is born outside of the UK.
And that's Brent, for example,
40% of London is born outside of the UK. In places like Brent, where 40% of social housing goes to people outside the UK, it's actually much, much, much higher than that. I grew up in Brent, and bloody hell, like that is the result of it. It's just the local population needs are reflecting who is getting the social housing, and that is critical here.
It's just so tied in with the question of immigration, isn't it? And we know that majorities of all voting groups, even Liberal Democrats, tend to think that immigration levels should be lower. And the first thing when you talk to people is the housing connection. So I think we can't really separate those two issues, and that's how people feel.
Right, but is it an attempt by the government to do exactly that, conflate the two issues, bring immigration into an issue where the rules seem to be pretty clear that you cannot access social housing unless you have indefinite leave to remain, and some authorities say even then you have to have lived here for 5 years?
The government doesn't decide what The Guardian chooses to put at the top of its website and make a big news story. I mean, there are any number of consultations running. You know, I probably wouldn't manage to keep the attention of your viewers if we went through all the things that the government is currently running a consultation on.
That's good use of time, isn't it?
Is focused on, as I said, a positive record when it comes to social housing in comparison to the previous Labour government, because we know these things are challenging. Actually, social housing waiting lists are down overall since 2010. We all know as MPs that there are constituents struggling in this regard, and we do need to build more houses. But I think, as I said, the principle that people who've been here a long time and paid in, I think, is a fair one.
All right, let's talk about knife crime. There's been a lot about this subject this week, particularly with the case of the two students and also a father being killed in Nottingham last year. BBC News headline, Zombie Knives. Government announces third crackdown since 2016. They're trying to close a legal loophole in terms of people carrying zombie-style knives. They're changing the definition to include more knives than was covered in the original definition. Now, the problem are the figures. I mean, Kieran, again, the ONS figures show an increase in England and Wales of 70% in terms of night crime from 2015. It's a failure.
So, overall, knife crime since 2010, since the Conservatives have been, is down by 25%.
Right, but just take those figures from 2014-15. There has been an increase of 70%.
It's important to give the context. You know, crime figures do vary over time. The overall trend, which I think is important your viewers understand that, is it's down by more than a quarter. And of course, you know, where we have real challenges, not just in London, but one of the areas where we have a real challenge, Labour in charge of policing in London. You know, people forget that. Labour are in charge of policing in London. I'm very much welcome the steps we've taken today. I'm particularly keen on the change we've made, actually, not just on the ones you've mentioned, but giving the police the power to seize what could be dangerous weapons and knives in homes. I spent time as a volunteer policeman. It can be frustrating if you know, you're in a house for one particular reason and you see things that are dangerous and you wish you could act and you can't. I think the government always has to be nimble when it comes to enacting legislation, because criminals change their behaviour. If you ban a certain thing under certain rules, then they'll come up with you know, another way of doing these things.
But this is an epidemic, it's been called. And actually, you're right, Kieran, when it comes to the figures in London. Angela, Sadiq Khan has also presided over a period of failure when it comes to tackling this. The ONS figures, again, for knife crimes in London show a 40% increase from 2015 to the year ending March last year. Sadiq Khan is in charge of London. He hasn't gripped this issue.
I did wonder how long it would take the Conservatives to say it's a problem in London, it's all Sadiq's fault. And you look across other metropolitan areas, in Birmingham, where there's a Conservative mayor, is equally facing challenges. So this isn't a political problem for mayors, but it is, I think, about legislation. And I think one thing I thought you said was really interesting. You said we have to look at the legislation and we shouldn't do it in a hurry. In 2016, the government was warned that the definition was very precise. It has to be a certain shape of knife, a certain edge, has to have a hole in a certain place, has to have writing on it. And we've been warned several times, and I think the government have announced now 16 times they're going to close that loophole, and we're getting there eventually, but it's taken 6 Home Secretaries to do so. I think with a number of things we need to do, be slightly less prescriptive on the kinds of knife. Now, I still think we need to look at swords, we look at ninja knives, but, you know, if it's a serrated edge of a certain curve, don't say you've got to have certain words written on it. That was quite nonsensical, really. You need to also look at the point of sale, including the use of ID and online sales as well. And you need, I think, to look at how you can have earlier intervention if someone's involved in knife crime or even a victim of knife crime. A lot of talk about young men being those who are perpetrators of knife crime. They're often the most likely to be victims as well.
But why do people have knives? Why do people feel the need, and it is mainly young men, feel the need to carry a knife?
I mean, I think I was listening to what Yvette Cooper was saying this morning, and they've got a new scheme which is called Young Futures. They're going to place hubs in these troubled communities. It all sounds, you know, good work and good effort, but it's a bit depressing to hear, because it reminds you of previous attempts. You mentioned Sadiq's Khan record. He had something called violence prevention units. All this talk of treating it as a mental health or a public health issue. The only thing surely that works is to go harder instead of softer on.
Well, do you agree with that? Because they have trialled sort of health-related programmes in Glasgow with some success, actually.
With great success. Glasgow was the murder capital of Western Europe not so long ago. It is now not, right? And I actually categorically completely disagree with what Freddie has just said. Part of the problem here, the reason it's taken 6 Home Secretaries just to try and ban a particular type of knife, which should not be controversial, is that this issue does not get adequate or commensurate attention in Westminster, right? Because what we're talking about here are people who have probably the weakest voices in our democracy, young people, overwhelmingly from minority ethnic backgrounds, from poor families and neglected neighbourhoods who have often been excluded from school. They basically have no influence whatsoever on politics and public policy in this country. And so when politicians do try and address the issue of knife crime, they are responding to the media coverage, not the causes of crime, not those individual tales of tragedy.
So what's the solution you're proposing?
So yes, absolutely ban these knives, but also ask what on earth caused people to wield that knife in the first place? Because if you don't address those causes, that will just bubble up and people wield a different form of blade.
But what is the answer to that?
There's no one answer, is there? It is a package
but is the
of
political
answers.
will there? I mean, I think that's what Party's saying. Has it really been there, whether it's Sadiq Khan or whether it's the Home Secretary? I have
to say, there's only so much the mayors can do, and across the country that all the mayors will tell you the same. They need legislation. But I think it's bringing together the criminal justice system, the health system, the education system, the police as well. There isn't one thing that's going to say, oh, we can do this, it's going to solve the problem. If you look at how we dealt with a lot of issues with Sure Start centres, which the Labour government brought in, you were tackling issues at source. You were bringing families together, you were giving support. That will have a huge impact if at the same time you're taking action against those who are selling knives, including online marketplaces, which just seem to be flouting the law and no one's
We
picking it
have
up.
to mention the mental health of the tragic case in Nottingham. I was just listening to the judge sentencing Mr. Callaghan, the person who committed these murders. He was clearly extremely mentally unwell and should not have been on the street. Absolutely. And there were multiple signs. So this was categorically a failure of government. And I think we need to just be much tougher, yes, on the knives, but also when people are clearly a danger and when there have been multiple signs, they need to be sectioned.
Well, let Kieran respond.
One thing I think we don't talk enough about and is actually parenting. When it comes to any kind of criminal activity by young people, politicians of all colours are afraid to actually say, well, actually, the people who are most responsible for ensuring young people understand the rules of society, follow those rules of society, feel loved and cared for and want to be part of society are people's parents, and we don't do.
And is there enough support?
That.
But is there enough support
well, actually,
for parents?
It's, you know,
you stopped Sure Start, you cancelled it.
I'm glad you raised that, because the thing that I never forget from my time, as I mentioned, as a volunteer policeman, is on all those difficult parts of our country where there are some people who are struggling, as Angela might argue, without services. There are other people who, without those services, still manage to imbue their children with the values and the approach to life that make a difference. And we mustn't always excuse behaviour by saying, well, because there wasn't a youth club in that area, that's why someone was turned to crime.
Kieran, like me, you're a medic, right? You have seen stab wounds, and you know you cannot just treat the stab wound. You have to treat the conditions that made that stab wound possible.
Part of that
for as long as we see knife crime as purely a criminal issue, we'll keep seeking solutions in tougher sentences, in tougher policing. That is exactly what we've been doing for the past 2 decades, right?
You need both.
The average sentence for knife offences has just rocketed up. Despite that, we've seen a rise in knife crime, right?
No, we haven't. As I said, we've seen a
well, hang on. Listen, we can trade statistics, but the ONS broadly says it is actually beginning to creep up, depending on how you're defining the offence and the attack and so on. But I think, broadly speaking, we can say knife crime is a really big issue. When it comes to tougher, you said a tougher approach. I mean, what are you calling for? Well, because the mother of one of the students who was tragically killed has said that she would like to see, I think I've understood it correctly, mandatory compulsory jail sentences for possession of a knife.
I'm really fascinated why the Tories haven't taken that up. It seems perfectly it's being suggested today by the parents of one of the victims. And oddly, you know, we see here the Labour politician, the Tory politician trading statistics and blaming each other. Actually, there's not much political disagreement on this issue, weirdly. Well, there are no libertarians in the Tory party who would disagree with banning more knives or being tougher on knife sentencing.
The current law, I think it's important to understand, the current law is on a second offence. You can expect to face a jail sentence. And I think we'd have to be careful about saying in every single possible
because not everyone is carrying enough to use as an offensive weapon.
I think, yes, indeed, but I have to also admit there probably are some people who are caught with that purpose who don't face immediate jail sentence, which is why I do have some sympathy with understanding you can't just immediately throw someone in prison for that, but we've already got that second offence measure. And I think to say that the government isn't taking this seriously and there isn't the political will, we've got the Prime Minister out fronting a major announcement on this today. The number of attempts we've made to narrow down the loopholes show that political will is there.
Well, you've made an announcement. Hang on.
We're laying the legislation today.
You'd lay it today, but this has been going on for a number of years. 6 Home Secretaries, 16 announcements.
So are you saying that Labour are going to immediately ban all possible weapons within 6 months of government? You need an actual plan for how you're going to do these things.
Let me give you a clue here. We've announced a plan today. You're in government. You've had 14 years to do it and you've mucked it up. There is a loophole in the law. You've had 16 announcements from 6 different Home Secretaries. They're going to close the loophole. So yes, it's good we have an announcement today.
Can we just talk?
Why have we waited?
Can we just talk about?
There are some swords that are not weapons. People have religious swords in their homes. People have antique swords in their homes. So actually, these things are not as simple as Labour like.
I'm not. All right. Well, no one's saying it's simple.
Let's talk about stop and search, because that is one of the things that has been used. It was to some extent used less widely a few years ago. But Chris Philp, the police minister, was on BBC Breakfast this morning, and he is saying it should be used more widely. But the actor and campaigner Idris Elba was listening to Chris Philp, and let's get his response.
the facts are the facts that stop and search has taken knives off people, but it is almost like just putting a plaster over a major wound, you know. And also, you have to understand, stop and search sometimes antagonizes communities where the youths don't have any other thing but to be a part of a gang or in the street. That antagonization causes more friction, causes a lot of, I'd say, disruption in the neighborhood, right? Now, of course, stop and search, you stop someone, they've got a knife, you take it off, that's a win. But it's, again, it's a Band-Aid, it's a plaster. It isn't a preventative measure. I think we need to find other measures that, you know, really address the reasons why young people are using knives.
Do you agree with Chris Philp it should be used more?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very important policing tool. And I think, you know, going back to that parent's point, every parent should be telling their children, whatever their background, if you're stopped and searched by the police for the purpose of trying to find a knife, that's a good thing. Now, if young people, as some of them do, we know, have a negative experience of that, that should be tackled, and those parents should also encourage them to tackle that. But we should stop this negative rhetoric about stop and search, because it's very important. And actually, you find the parents of victims of knife crime, very many of them will say they want to see more stop and search. If there'd been more stop and search, it would have helped.
It's a good thing.
No, I mean, the problem is we keep seeing it as an either-or. Either we do stop and search, or we do the neighbourhood services, and we do things. We have to do both. When you look at what happened in Scotland, the success in Scotland was based on, yes, stop and search was a big aspect of that at the start, but then it gave way to many more upstream causes, right? 3/4 of young people with a prison sentence were excluded from school, right? That is obscene. We are failing our children because essentially, being excluded from school is a one-way ticket to prison. That is exactly what we need to start paying attention to, not just stop and search, which yes is part of it, but it's not the only thing.
I don't disagree with that about kids being excluded from school, but what Idris Elba just mentioned, I have great respect for him. He cares a lot about this. He's run a great campaign, but antagonising a community, that kind of rhetoric, cannot be the priority here. People,
but it does alienate communities, does it? If you repeatedly stop and search them.
You know, we had the sentencing today. The first duty of a government is to provide safety for its citizens, and if people are being stabbed, that, I'm afraid, overrides secondary questions like whether particular communities might feel antagonised by getting searched on stop and search. If you find knives on people, they've got to be taken away.
I remember seeing on social media a lady who was going, you know, very, very cross with some police officers because they'd stopped and searched someone, was really giving them a very, very hard time. And they'd searched and produced, you know, a very serious knife on that individual. It's not helpful rhetoric to suggest that stop and search is a negative activity. I completely agree with you, but it isn't about just stop and search and all the rest is, you know, irrelevant. But it's an important tool, and we shouldn't talk it down, because that actually, as in, from my own experience, it creates friction when you're conducting stop and search. If people think that they're being targeted for the wrong reasons, it's there as a safety measure, and overwhelmingly, I believe, is conducted in good faith basis by the police officers doing it.
All right, let's talk about the medicines shortage, or in some medicines anyway. Daily Mail headline warning that NHS medicine shortage is putting lives at risk as pharmacists say crisis is worse than ever. Now, around 100 medicines are on a shortage list, including drugs used to treat epilepsy, type 2 diabetes, heart-related chest pain, ADHD and cancer. Let's talk to Ellie Middleton, who is on ADHD medication. Hello to you, Ellie. Thank you for joining us. How hard has it been to get your medication?
Yeah, it's been really difficult and really stressful. I think from the start of the shortages, I initially found out via social media rather than being contacted by my psychiatrist or by my medical team. And then from then, it's just kind of been anxiety of knowing when I'm going to get it, if I'm going to be able to get it. I initially got a text from my GP a couple of weeks after finding about it online saying that they wouldn't be able to order my prescription anymore, and if I needed to get it, I would need to speak to a hospital consultant, but there was no information of who that consultant would be, how I would contact them, how long it would take for me to be able to get through to them or get an appointment, and there was kind of no further information given. From that point, a few times I've had to go around kind of 5+ pharmacists trying to find a medication. A couple of times I've only been able to get 20 tablets rather than the 28 that I'm supposed to get. And so I've decided to ration my medication, really. So I've not been taking it every day as I'm supposed to and as I'm prescribed to, because I just don't know how long each prescription is going to have to last me for. So that's causing a lot of anxiety, I think, especially because we've not been told that the right thing to do. I've not had any kind of face-to-face or telephone contact with any medical professionals since the shortages have begun. It was just kind of a text message saying, sorry, we can't get it for you. and that was that.
All right. Well, Ellie, thank you very much. I can imagine it must be extremely stressful when you don't know when you might get your next medication. We have two doctors on the panel. Not that they can solve the problem, but they have a certain amount of expertise. Why are we having these shortages, Parth?
It's an excellent question. First of all, I just want to say I'm really sorry to hear that, Ellie. That is, I mean, the fact that that's happening in the UK in this day and age, that you can't access your medicines, that is just a complete tragic failure of what's going on. Why it's going on is a pretty complicated question, right? Part of this is part of the supply chain disruptions that have been going on since the pandemic, the Ukraine war, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, right? That is affecting shipping routes and it's affecting how medicines are getting to
and affecting every country.
That is affecting every country.
Okay.
We're seeing this. So the medicine shortage is actually a really salient issue in the European Union right now. Belgium has made it a big deal as part of its EU Council presidency. France is starting to build new pharmaceutical factories, right? And so what's going on here is that we've got those global supply chain disruptions, whether it's wheat or semiconductors or medicines, and then you're compounded by Brexit, right? Which is partly because of extra regulatory problems, partly because of the falling value of the pound, but also we're just not part of the solutions, right? Already what's going on is the EU has mobilised. They have started stockpiling key medicines. They've started increasing domestic production in Western Europe. We're not doing either of those things. This barely even registers on the government agenda. When Rishi Sunak was asked about it, he denied that there was even a shortage of a key antibiotic. What are we doing about this instead?
Well, the idea of bringing it always comes back to Brexit, doesn't it? And I'm kind of waiting for the B word to come out, but the reality is 25 out of 27 EU countries are facing severe shortages of medical equipment and drugs. So this is not primarily a Brexit issue.
But they're acting together on it.
But what you said about the global supply chains is really the important issue here. That we have all been used for the last decades, plural, to a world in which supply chains are safe, and for all of our daily needs we can rely on things coming from the other side of the world. Suddenly that doesn't look so secure anymore. So I think all political parties need to think, how are we going to be resilient and survive in this much more dangerous, fractured world where we can't rely on drugs from the other side of the world?
Right. I mean, has Brexit exacerbated it?
Any good evidence that it's playing a role here. As we've heard, that these are problems that are affecting the whole world. The US is at a kind of 10-year high in terms of medicine shortages all across the EU. They're struggling with this problem. And actually, in some respects, going forward, we're more able to act on generally the issue of medicines than we were before because of Brexit. We've announced,
what way?
Well, actually, when it comes to taking a decision on regulatory recognition of decisions and approvals taken in other countries, so with the US or the EU approve a medicine...
Does that help supply?
Well, it's certainly in terms of the chain of new medicines, alternative medicines that come on board, future medicines. That's an example of where our Brexit freedoms allow us to act more nimbly than when you're tied down. And actually, we saw during the vaccine programme, we were able to act more nimbly than the EU. Going back to Ellie,
could have done it within the EU, but anyway.
Well, in reality, the political reality was that we did it and none of them did. Yeah. And Ellie, I would encourage her to contact her MP if she hasn't already, to see if they can give her any advice and support. And I would want her to have a conversation with a healthcare professional. I think that's a reasonable thing to ask. I know the government does act on these supply chain issues when they arise, but it can't fix them overnight, unfortunately. But
you obviously can't see a doctor very easily, never mind the MP. But anyway,
I would say I'm really sorry. I think it's just terrible things happening to you, but I think your GP might be of more use to you and your MP, if I'm honest. But what I found interesting, what you're saying there, is how we can act more nimbly, how we can do more since Brexit. So why haven't we done so? And what worries me about this, and I think it's not just us, it's happening in many countries, but I think the government's been a little complacent because it's increased, it's doubled, the problem's doubled in the last year. There's been warnings about it. So if we can act more nimbly, if we've got more freedoms to deal with it, why haven't we done so? And that would be my answer, because I think it's a challenge for any government to deal with. It's not just our problem. We're having to go it alone because we're not part of a group anymore. But if the government is telling us, ignore Brexit, it's made it easier for us, then there's a question to answer. How has it been let to get so bad?
Well, so what's Labour's actual policy that you can? What are you going to commit to on the show today that means that 2 years from now the problem will be...
Well, hang on. Answer Angela's question first, and then I'll put that back to Angela.
I'm saying it's a very complex issue. Government needs to plan ahead for it and look at some of the other issues that are going ahead and work with other countries.
What about
you're saying to me,
reshoring?
hang on a minute, you're saying to me that it's OK because we can act more nimbly. You said we can
I
act
didn't say
more
the problem
nimbly.
was OK. I was
You
talking
said
to the
we
point
can
of
act-
Brexit and whether Brexit's a factor. I was talking about that specifically.
And you're saying it's helped us act more nimbly. So I'm saying if that is useful, why hasn't it been done? None of this is going to help Ellie. She just needs to have her medication, as thousands of others do. I don't know the answers. I'm not a medical
across
person.
government, there's not a single...
I want to know what's being done at the moment.
Let Kieran respond.
Every time the government has a... I mean, the point I think we should work on globally is about data sharing and understanding where these supply chain issues are, and the industry need to work with us on that. Because when the government knows about a problem, and it can't know in advance, there's a supply chain issue a year from now, then it does... And throughout the last year on a number of medicines, it's actually been able to step in, negotiate and secure further supplies, including, I don't know about any specific medication, but on other ADHD medications, on HRT, we saw the government action.
I mean, that is not quite right. The guidelines on HRT were changed months, years in advance, and we did not stockpile extra HRT, and all of a sudden, we've run out of HRT.
Can I just say from the Department of Health, and then let me come to you, Freddie, because you were going to say something about reassuring people, but the Department of Health maintains that the vast majority of medicines are in good supply, and they are trying to work through issues like HRT and ADHD. What were you going to say?
I was actually going to talk about reshoring rather than reassuring. Although reassuring is also important. I don't think we have yet understood the scale of what's about to happen. If these supply chains are interrupted for the time to come, which it looks like they will be, it's not just medicine. It's foods, it's vital equipment that we need. It's actually industry. And I think the conversation is going to become, how can we guarantee that the crucial things we need are actually manufactured closer to home? And that is going to cut across
Freddie,
political parties.
There are over 10,000 different medications one can prescribe in the UK. You want to reshore all of them.
That's the scale of the problem. That's exactly right.
Simply not possible. You do have to coordinate with other countries. Making supply chains more resilient is more than just reshoring, right? It's also friendshoring.
Right.
And that is a slightly different thing. And that requires probably cooperation with the EU, who are far ahead on this issue than we are. And that's the key thing.
Can I just ask about something else I didn't know about, a voluntary scheme? Because apparently the UK has negotiated well on the price of drugs with pharmaceutical companies. So good value for the taxpayer, but perhaps not so good for supply. Have we become a victim of our own success in terms of that price negotiation?
Yeah, it's a slightly thorny issue because the NHS does get really good bang for buck for the medicines it wants, right? But the problem is, because the pound has been devalued, all medicines now that we're trying to purchase are more expensive. But there's a cap on how much the NHS can spend. And so it has to ration what it can and cannot buy. And that is holding back how many medicines we can get and how much we want to pay for. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't really want to give us more than they already do because they have to then pay a levy on the extra sales.
It's also a lot of medication nowadays is preventative, and we're trying to solve problems later on in terms of stroke, in terms of heart disease. And so if we aren't able to supply the medications we need and give assurance of that for the longer term, then down the chain you're going to see people suffering from more conditions like stroke and heart disease. So I think one of the worrying thing is if we can't resolve this problem, and I think we have to do it by working with others. I think trying to go it alone isn't a great idea on these kind of international issues that affect other countries as well. Right. There's going to need to be a longer term plan and also an early flagging system. Because we've known about this for quite a long time, it doesn't seem to me it was flagged up early enough to start getting the plans in place to address it further down the chain.
Right, Ellie, you've heard the reasons, some of the reasons that have been suggested, but does any of that really help you?
I think I just consistently feel let down by the health system and the government in terms of ADHD and it being taken seriously as a disability. I went undiagnosed with ADHD for 24 years, despite reaching crisis point multiple times, having to drop out of school, having to leave jobs, becoming severely unwell because of my undiagnosed disabilities, and was under mental health care in the NHS, and not one person ever considered whether ADHD might be what was going on for me. I then had to go private for a diagnosis. If it wasn't for me being in an incredibly privileged position to be able to afford a private diagnosis, I would still be on the NHS waiting list for a diagnosis to this day. And the suggestion of going to speak to my GP, well, my GP has no idea about my ADHD. Right. Not able to prescribe that medication because it's a controlled drug, and there's no way for me to access a psychiatrist through the NHS. So I think we need to start taking ADHD as seriously as it is. It's a disability. It's not just some quirky thing that people have to deal with. It has a huge impact on hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And it just doesn't feel like that's taken seriously, or there's not been anything put in place with these cuts. You know, we've lost access to medication. Where's the therapy? Where's the coaching? Where's the advice of what we should do in the meantime? There's been absolutely no holistic support provided in these different
Ellie Middleton, thank you very much for sharing your experience, and I hope you find it progressively easier to access the medicine for your ADHD. Let's talk about the Rwanda bill, because the bill is to deport asylum seekers arriving on UK shores by small boats, because it goes in front of the House of Lords on Monday, which is where Angela sits as Labour leader in the House of Lords. It passed in the House of Commons, but Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, had this warning for peers.
This is an urgent national priority. The treaty with Rwanda is signed, and the legislation which deems Rwanda a safe country has been passed unamended in our elected chamber. There is now only one question. Will the opposition in the appointed House of Lords try and frustrate the will of the people as expressed by the elected House, or will they get on board and do the right thing?
Are you going to do the right thing, Angela?
We always do the right thing. Of course we do. I think that press conference was absolutely extraordinary, because he said during the press conference, what we've got to do is pass this in the Lords in the same time as we pass it in the House of Commons. And yet that day we had the email from the government telling us what the timetable was, which was we should probably finish consideration around about mid-March. So don't think he knew what his own government was doing on this anyway. But the only time Prime Ministers actually get very excited about the House of Lords and how the House of Lords goes through its normal process of legislation is when they're worried about their own side. And from his own side, no one thinks this is going to work. It's realistically. We've paid so far, £400 million has been spent so far on this legislation. The House of Lords isn't going to say, no, you can't have the bill, but we are going to look at the detail of it. Now, one of the things that happened on Monday...
let me just put that...
It's a normal process for every other bill.
That is the normal process.
Really
what's wrong with scrutinising it?
It won't surprise me that Labour will do everything it possibly can to frustrate this legislation. They've voted against every single thing we've done when it comes to trying to toughen up these rules. They don't have a plan for this. We do. And so they're going to do whatever they can to frustrate it.
Is that what it says in your notes?
What I would remind everybody is that Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party who said previously that he thinks all immigration policy is inherently racist, who wanted free movement when it comes to the EU, and who actually campaigned to stop us deporting a group of foreign criminals. That's where his heart is on these issues, and they can do whatever they want to try and kind of rehash him as this newfound tough on immigration guy. Those are things he's done in his time as a Labour Party MP leader.
I've been in the House of Lords now for quite a long time. I've been leader for the last 8 years, and I've heard that rhetoric time and time again. No, let's calm down a bit. We've got legislation coming through. Nobody thinks it's going to stop the boats. This is the third piece of legislation we've had from the government.
When you say nobody, what are you...
Oh, he does it. OK, let's put...
Well,
nobody realistically...
It's been passed in the Commons. I mean, just to explain, it's been passed in the Commons, and you know that the House of Lords is there to scrutinise legislation and improve it, usually, but not frustrate it.
No, that's always...
Voters like it. That's the amazing thing about this. It will be studied for generations to come, because all of it's not got anywhere. It's been thwarted. It's now this kind of joke policy within Westminster. And yet, amazingly, even now, I checked the opinion polling before coming on, most people support it. That's the extraordinary...
That is on the assumption that it works to its intended goal. Will the Rwanda policy...
As a deterrent?
Well, does it stop the boats? And the answer is categorically no, because of basic...
But we don't know.
Hang on. This is the third...
Not all over each other.
This is the third separate piece of legislation we've had from the government in the last few years that it will stop the boats. The one thing that would make the biggest impact on stopping the boats is getting hold of these criminal gangs who bring people over, who put their lives at risk coming in these boats out of this country. I want to stop the boats. I hate the idea of people putting themselves into small boats, and I really resent the government thinks we don't want to do that. But sending asylum seekers over to Rwanda to be processed by Rwandan immigration officials who haven't yet been trained to do the job, to do it properly. We don't know yet if people who fail asylum seekers will be sent back to the UK. We've spent £400 million so far, and there's been more Home Secretaries who've gone to Rwanda than asylum seekers. So before you get totally excited about the House of Lords, we will do the job of work we normally do with this bill.
Right.
If the government behaves as it did on Monday night when we were looking at the treaty, and the Minister couldn't even answer when the measures that the government says will have to be in place before it can ratify the treaty.
But you are going to oppose it. You will oppose it.
The Labour Party opposes the bill, yes.
There you go.
Right,
but in the House of Lords, we are not going to frustrate the bill going back to the House of Commons.
They oppose it. They oppose it. They oppose our legislation.
They can oppose it, but
more than
what we will do is
crossings are
pass
down.
some amendments, I expect, that the House of Commons will consider. The House of Commons always has the final word.
Yeah.
Let's just
So
for a
crossings
second
are down by a
think
third.
about
Well,
what
let Kieran and I'll come to you.
Crossings are down by a third. Patrols on the French coast are up. We've stopped more than 20,000 crossings.
So why do you need
this
the
year.
Rwanda bill then?
Because actually we cannot sustain this crossings and stopping crossings. And actually what Labour do not have is any plan for whatever you do on safe and legal routes or all this other stuff that you're doing. There will always be people who don't fall under that policy who want to cross, and that you can't police your way out of an entire coastline of people crossing. What you have to have is, as the Australians did, a very clear policy that if you come to this country passing through a safe third country like France, you won't get to stay here.
The problem is, though, Kieran, hang on, the problem isn't just the Labour Party or opposition parties. There are a whole wealth of bodies who are against this too, including the European Court of Human Rights, the president of which has said the UK has an obligation to follow its injunctions. Now, these are the injunctions that parts of the Conservative Party are extremely upset about. They want Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, to ignore any injunctions. Do you agree with ignoring them?
You have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but I'd be hugely sympathetic to ignoring injunctions, and we have people like Lord Sumpter and other very respected judicial figures who agree that we shouldn't have to follow those injunctions. And the other people that are opposed to this policy, to the UNHCR, they send refugees to settle in Rwanda. So I think they have to kind of come up with a slightly more considered position on this.
There are thousands of small objections to this, and it sounds quite technical, I suspect, to a lot of viewers back home. I think the attention is rightly on Angela, because most people expect that you guys are going to be in government relatively soon. And so far, I think it's fair to say there is no big idea of how you communicate back down those networks. And maybe Rwanda is never going to happen now, but there needs to be something as dramatic that will communicate that we are not...
There are thousands of small injections, but two really big ones, right? The first one is a constitutional one. This legislation is saying, let's declare Rwanda a safe country for people to seek asylum in, despite all the facts on the ground, right? That poses serious constitutional questions.
That's your reading of the facts on the ground? Or?
No, that's a court.
It's about everyone's reading. In fact, it's been the Israeli government who has withdrawn from a similar scheme's reading of the ground, right? And so there is reason to say that when it raises fundamental constitutional questions like that, we do need to think about, is the government abusing its power? But second of all, there's just a practical problem here. Rwanda processed 164 asylum claims last year. About 40,000 people came to the UK on small boats.
But as we say,
the numbers don't add up.
The idea is to be a deterrent. On your first point, do you agree, though, with the Supreme Court ruling that did say it would be lawful for asylum applications to be processed in a third country? Not Rwanda, but in a third country. Do you agree that that is lawful and that is something that should be followed?
But that's not for me to say. I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not a legal philosopher.
No, but would you agree with the idea of them being offshored like that?
I think it's not really policy that addresses the core issues.
But there are different... Can I just come back to this thing about offshore processing? There's two different issues. You mentioned Australia. Other countries have processed offshore, but they do so with their own officials, within their own laws and their own rules and regulations.
But is it moral?
Well, I think it depends how people are treated and whether it's in the law. The danger here is we're sending them to Rwanda, a country from which we accept asylum seekers, and we're handing it over to the Rwandan system. Now, that's why it was regarded as not being safe. The government says, but we can make it safe and we'll do these things. Pass the law, but we can't tell you when we will do them, how we'll do them, how they'll be in place.
Just to say a country is safe.
It's absurd.
I think that the paradox here is that actually, if you want to live in a kind of rules-based liberal democracy, which I think we all do, you need to be able to control who's coming in.
Yes.
And so actually, it's almost a defence of a liberal democracy to make sure that you have those controls. And
I'm not disputing that.
There needs to be, if you don't like the Rwanda plan, we need to hear something else which actually says, okay, we're not going to let people into our system, which is fair and law-abiding, unless we invite them in.
I don't disagree with some of that, but what you're saying, where's your big idea? This will not be solved by something that's eye-catchingly wonderful, like they say, we're going to do Rwanda, listen to us, we're doing something big. It's going to be by good policing, it's going to be cooperation, it's going to be processing asylum seekers so you haven't got the massive backlog that you drew up. It's all those things that will make a difference.
Because everyone's got a mobile phone, all these guys see...
That's part of it, but it has to be a whole range of things coming together that you treat people fairly, and you also look at the causes of why people flee their countries and these criminal gangs who are vile, who are taking money off people to put their lives at risk into small boats.
But Kieran, can I just ask you, sitting here today, do you think any plane will take off for Rwanda before the election?
Yes, and I think,
do you?
And I think you will see the rest of the Western world over time following our approach. There is a new and very significant challenge when it comes to mass migration.
How much will it cost per asylum seeker?
Well, actually, the whole point of the policy, Angela, is that it's a disincentive. So it's not about the individual asylum seekers. It's the fact that people know that they will go there and then therefore won't make the journey. So, and the other point about processing, I think people have missed in the treaty is that actually Rwanda has confirmed that they will allow people to stay even if they don't have a successful asylum claim. So all those risks we've listened to, we've listened to those. We've come up with a new plan, and as Freddie said, Labour have no plan.
That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Politics UK will be here tomorrow at 12:15, and I'll be back on Monday, of course, with more Politics Live. But from all of us here, very good afternoon.